Hi, my name is Kacie Webster, and today I will be demonstrating my Because You Listen To podcast recommender. So the inspiration for my project stems from my interest and appreciation for recommenders, whether it be through Netflix or Amazon or YouTube. And I thought an interesting way to apply this idea would be to podcasts. And I was luckily able to find a data set that would allow me to do that. And so the data is from listennotes.com and it contains 19,126 podcasts. And so each podcast comes with its title, a short text description of what it's about, the category it was assigned to, and the language it's in. And so we're just going to take a look at some of these columns to get a feel for what's going on. And so the categories, I wanted to kind of see the different proportions and like what's the most common category and stuff like that. And so I created this bar plot and there were actually 83 different categories. So I filtered for the most common ones. And so after some calculations, I found that the top 5 categories were spirituality, religion, Christianity, culture, and society. And so you can kind of see that the majority or the podcasts tend to be more about spirituality and religion and yeah. And so the next thing I wanted to see was the distribution of the languages in the podcast. And so you can see that English is about 80% of the podcast. And so the other languages really dropped off, with German being the most common at 3.61%. And since I still wanted to include those podcasts in the recommendations, I ended up translating those texts into English so that they would still be accounted for. And so for the actual recommender, I created this little visualization to better explain what's going on. And so basically each podcast is going to have the number of times or the count of how many times these words appear in the podcast content. So for example, podcast 1, the word basketball will appear once in its content. And then the recommender will then compare each of these podcasts against each other and return the cosine similarity score for those two podcasts. And then in the end, it will return the podcast with the highest cosine similarity in the end. And so for an example, I just asked what podcast would we recommend for podcast 1? So the cosine similarity of podcast 1 and 2 was about 90%. And for podcast 1 and 3 was about 45%. And so since 90 is greater than 45, we would recommend podcast 2 before we would recommend podcast 3. And so now we're just going to take a look at how this works with the actual data set. So here is a web application I created to better represent the recommender. And it just comes with a little description on how this recommender works and what it's based on, and some directions for the users to actually use the recommender. And so basically just you need to provide the title of the podcast and the number of recommendations you would like. And so an example that I have is this podcast called Sugar High, which is about this guy who interviews people from the music industry about what it's really like. And then I will just ask for 5 recommendations. And so you can see it returns a table with the titles of the podcast along with its category to kind of make sure, as like a sanity check, that these podcasts are actually similar and this recommender actually works. And so that's kind of basically how it works. This recommender is mostly for podcasts that are not as popular, not as mainstream. And so this is definitely useful for people who want to find those like hidden gems. And so just a representation of what would happen if it does see a title it doesn't recognize, since it was built on only 19,000 podcasts. I'm currently listening to this podcast, Missing in Alaska. And so when I input that, it'll just return, we're sorry, but we couldn't find your podcast. So that's basically what happens when it doesn't recognize the title. And we'll just go back to the presentation. And so that sums up my demonstration for my podcast recommender. And here is my contact information along with the tech I used. And thank you for listening.